Imagine yourself as a child, waking up in a small, dimly lit wooden house somewhere in medieval Europe. The smell of smoke from the hearth still lingers in the air, and outside, roosters have already announced the coming of morning. You rub your eyes, not because you were up late reading a book or studying from a printed page. No, books are far too rare, and printed pages do not yet exist. Instead, you are rising to begin a very different sort of school day, one that feels both familiar and completely alien compared to what you know today. For a medieval child, learning did not start with bright classrooms, colorful chalkboards, or even simple paper notebooks. Instead, it began with wax tablets. A wax tablet was a piece of wood covered with a thin layer of wax, into which you could carve letters using a small pointed stylus. To erase, you would smooth the surface with the flat end of the stylus. It was a tool that combined the practicality of reusability with the quiet simplicity of a world where every resource mattered. Paper was costly, parchment even more so, and ink could not be wasted on a child's clumsy handwriting. The wax tablet, cheap and durable, was the medieval version of a school notebook. The very first thing a child would often learn was the alphabet. Not the alphabet as we might see it today, but the Latin alphabet, since Latin was the language of the church, scholarship, and most formal writing across Europe. A child might sit cross-legged on a bench or the floor of a chilly room, tracing the shapes of the letters A, B, C, with great effort. Unlike the smooth pens and pencils of today, the stylus scratched unevenly, and mistakes were common. You can imagine the tedious repetition, writing a crooked A, smoothing the wax, writing it again, and again, until the strokes felt almost natural. But it was not just about learning letters. Each letter was associated with sounds, prayers, and sometimes even moral lessons. The alphabet itself often became a vehicle for religious instruction. A could stand for Ave Maria, the greeting to Mary. B might remind the child of Beatus, meaning blessed. In this way, even the dry practice of forming letters was imbued with moral and religious meaning. You weren't just learning to write, you were learning to tie every symbol to the spiritual framework that governed medieval life. The place where this learning took place varied depending on your station in life. If you were the child of a wealthy family, perhaps a merchant or a minor noble, you might attend a small school attached to a monastery or cathedral. There, a stern but educated cleric would guide you through the lessons, sometimes with patience, often with severity. For children of the poor, however, schooling was not guaranteed. Most would learn only at home, absorbing skills from parents, farming, weaving, tending animals. Yet, in towns and larger villages, even poorer children might have some chance to attend what were called song schools, where the first task was not writing but singing, because memorizing hymns and psalms was considered a path toward literacy and virtue. In the classroom, discipline was harsh. A child fidgeting or failing to repeat a prayer correctly might receive a sharp smack on the hand or worse. Learning was serious business, meant to shape not only the mind but the soul. To forget a line of Latin, to stumble over a psalm, was not just laziness but a small moral failure. The expectation was that learning required obedience and endurance, not curiosity or creativity. Alongside the alphabet, children began learning simple prayers. The Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, and the Creed were among the earliest memorized pieces. These were not just religious formulas, they were thought to be protective charms, shields against sin and evil. A child might mutter the words under their breath while walking home, repeating them again and again, like a lullaby of protection. The rhythm of these prayers shaped the cadence of thought, embedding religion into the very foundation of memory. Writing on wax tablets had its own strange challenges. The wax would sometimes grow soft in the summer heat or harden in winter's chill, making it difficult to carve letters cleanly. Children would scrape the wax smooth so often that the surface became uneven, full of faint traces of old letters, like ghosts of earlier lessons. In a sense, every child's wax tablet carried the imprint of their struggle, the faint remains of mistakes and repetitions that built their first foundation of literacy. Imagine, too, the soundscape of the classroom. It was not a quiet place. Children would often repeat lessons aloud, chanting the alphabet, prayers, or psalms in unison. The droning sound of young voices filled the air, mixing with the scratching of styluses on wax. Teachers believed that speaking aloud strengthened memory, and so learning was a noisy, communal process, far removed from the silent rows of modern classrooms. Over time, as a child mastered the alphabet, they moved on to syllables and then simple words. These words were not chosen at random. They often carried moral or biblical meaning. Lists of syllables would be combined into words like Dominus, Lord, Pax, Peace, Fides, Faith, or Lux, Light. Each new word felt like a tiny window opening into a world that was at once practical and spiritual. Literacy was not pursued for pleasure or creativity but as a way to understand scripture, prayers, and the moral codes that structured society. The actual experience of being a medieval child in school was shaped by small discomforts and long hours. Imagine stiff wooden benches without backs, cold stone floors beneath your feet, the dim light of a few candles or narrow windows, and the ever-present fear of making mistakes. Hunger might gnaw at your stomach if your family was poor. The smell of unwashed bodies and smoky air hung in the classroom. These details may feel unimportant to history, but they mattered to every child who endured them. And yet, despite these difficulties, there was a strange pride in learning. For a child who succeeded, the ability to read even a little Latin set them apart in their community. They could assist in church services, recite prayers others could not, or eventually keep simple accounts for trade. Literacy was a gateway to opportunity, though limited and heavily bound by class and circumstance. Parents, too, took pride in their child's progress. A father who saw his son trace Latin words might imagine him one day serving as a clerk, avoiding the backbreaking toil of farming. A mother who heard her daughter recite prayers could hope she might enter a convent and live with some measure of safety and dignity. Education was not only about the child, it was about the hopes and survival strategies of families navigating a difficult world. But one question lingers as we reflect on these earliest lessons. To what extent did the repetitive chants, the scratched letters on wax, the memorized prayers truly shape the inner lives of these children? Did they feel the weight of meaning behind every word, or did it all blend into the dull rhythm of habit? Were they conscious of learning as a privilege, or simply enduring a process they could not escape? By the time a medieval child had mastered the first clumsy shapes of letters and memorized their earliest prayers, the lessons grew gradually more demanding. Wax tablets and styluses still served as the main tools, but now, the focus shifted from simple alphabets and syllables to actual sentences, psalms, and fragments of Latin scripture. For many children, the Psalter, a collection of psalms from the Bible, was the first true book they encountered. Unlike wax tablets, a psalter was expensive, often handwritten on parchment, illuminated with careful artistry, and guarded with the respect due to something both sacred and costly. A child would rarely own one themselves. Instead, they copied and recited from the master's copy. In some schools, a large psalter was chained to the lectern so no one could remove it. The teacher might read a line aloud, and the pupils, in chorus, would repeat it until the rhythm settled into their memories. The Psalms themselves were dense with repetition and poetic structure, making them ideal for oral learning. A child might chant lines for hours, not always understanding the Latin words, but internalizing their shapes and rhythms. Understanding was secondary, memory was the true goal. To be able to repeat scripture by heart was seen as both spiritual discipline and proof of learning. At this stage, writing also became more deliberate. Wax tablets were still common, but children might be introduced to ink and parchment, especially those from wealthier families or those destined for clerical work. The process of writing with a quill was slow and exacting. A feather had to be cut to the right angle, dipped carefully into ink, and pressed gently against the parchment. Too much ink, and it blotted; too little, and the letter faded. Mistakes were costly, as parchment could not simply be wiped clean like a wax surface. To scrape away errors with a knife was possible, but it left faint scars on the surface. Children quickly learned the value of precision. One can imagine the nervous tension of a child attempting their first sentences with ink, the teacher hovering over them, correcting posture, grip, and angle. Each letter had to follow strict forms, carved by tradition, reinforced by the church's authority. A child's handwriting was not meant to express individuality but conformity, mirroring centuries of scribal practice. In this sense, writing was less an act of creativity and more an act of obedience. Beyond the Psalms and alphabets, medieval schoolchildren often studied grammar, though not in the sense we think of today. For them, grammar meant the study of Latin itself, its vocabulary, its structure, and its proper use. Latin was the key to all higher knowledge, law, theology, philosophy, and thus, even the dullest child was drilled in its patterns. Teachers relied on well-known manuals, such as those by Donatus, a Roman grammarian whose works remained standard for centuries. Lines of Latin grammar were memorized like scripture, chanted aloud in unison, each repetition hammering the rules into the mind. And yet, this heavy emphasis on memory raises an interesting point. To what extent did children actually understand what they recited? For many, comprehension came slowly, if at all. The strange Latin words were distant from their everyday language, whether English, French, German, or Italian. For the poor child in a village school, Latin was a foreign tongue, useful mainly for repeating prayers and scripture. Perhaps they grasped the gist of certain words. Dominus meant Lord, Deus meant God, but the larger meanings often remained obscure. Still, understanding was not considered as essential as obedience and discipline. This rote style of learning was not unique to medieval Europe. Across many cultures, from Islamic madrasas to Confucian schools, repetition and memorization formed the backbone of education. But in the medieval Christian context, it carried particular weight. Memory was linked to salvation. To remember scripture was to carry it within one's soul, a form of protection and moral training. Forgetfulness, on the other hand, was a danger, a weakness that left one vulnerable to sin. Outside the classroom, these lessons seeped into daily life. A child who had memorized psalms might recite them while walking through fields, or before sleep, or when afraid of storms and illness. Parents encouraged such habits, reinforcing the sense that knowledge was not just for school but for survival. Even illiterate adults admired children who could speak Latin prayers, seeing in them a link to divine favor. As children progressed, they also encountered the concept of copying texts, not original writing, but the careful duplication of religious or grammatical passages. Copying was both a writing exercise and a spiritual one. To trace each letter of scripture was considered an act of devotion. A child bent over a parchment, painstakingly copying lines, might not realize that this tedious work mirrored the labor of monks in scriptoria across Europe. Every stroke of the quill was part of a much larger tradition, linking the smallest learner to the great chain of Christian scholarship. The social side of schooling was equally important. Children did not learn alone but sat shoulder to shoulder with others, sometimes in noisy, cramped rooms. Younger children were grouped with older ones, and lessons overlapped. A 6-year-old learning the alphabet might sit next to a 12-year-old memorizing complex psalms. The teacher managed them all at once, moving from child to child, correcting, scolding, praising. In this mixed environment, peer learning was inevitable. Younger children overheard advanced lessons, older ones reinforced their knowledge by helping the little ones. The result was a layered, communal education rather than a neatly divided grade system. Still, the experience was not equal for all. Boys were far more likely than girls to receive formal schooling, though exceptions existed. In convents, some girls received a surprisingly thorough education, learning not only prayers but also Latin grammar, music, and even practical medicine. For noble girls, education sometimes included reading romances or histories, though these were luxuries. For peasant girls, learning often remained confined to oral instruction at home, songs, prayers, and household skills. The unevenness of medieval education shaped generations, preserving literacy as a privilege for the few. Discipline remained harsh throughout. Teachers wielded rods or birch branches, believing that physical correction was essential to learning. Mispronouncing a word, failing to repeat a line, or showing inattention might earn swift punishment. From a modern perspective, this seems cruel, but in the medieval mindset, the rod was not merely about control, it was believed to guide the soul as much as the body. To spare discipline was to risk moral weakness. Education, in this sense, was inseparable from correction. And yet, despite the severity, some moments of wonder must have broken through the monotony. Imagine a child who, after weeks of struggle, finally recognized a word on parchment unaided. The thrill of reading pax, peace, or lux, light, must have felt profound. For a medieval mind, letters themselves carried a sacred aura. To unlock them, even at the most basic level, was to step into a mysterious, almost divine world. By the end of this stage, a child's life of learning was beginning to diverge. Some would continue on to deeper studies of grammar, rhetoric, or logic. Others would leave school behind to help on farms, in workshops, or in family businesses. Education was not universal, and even a few years of training set a child apart in a society where most adults could not read at all. To be literate, even minimally, was to hold a strange kind of power. This raises a question worth pausing on. Was education in the medieval world truly about opening minds, or was it more about shaping obedience and memory? Did children emerge from these schools with genuine understanding, or did they carry only fragments of scripture and rules, half-remembered chants and clumsy letters on wax? For us, these details might seem like the dull mechanics of a forgotten age, but for the children themselves, they were the earliest steps into the complicated path of adulthood. As the medieval child advanced through their first years of schooling, the lessons slowly shifted in purpose. The alphabet, psalms, and grammar drills remained the foundation, but new layers were added: moral instruction, stories of saints, and sometimes even practical knowledge tied to the rhythms of daily life. Education was not just about words and letters. It was about shaping a person who could function within the religious and social framework of the Middle Ages. By this stage, many children had moved beyond simple wax tablets. Though these remained useful tools, the more promising students, especially those from wealthier or clerical families, were given access to parchment books, copied by hand, sometimes centuries old. To open one of these volumes was to touch history itself. Each page represented hours of labor by monks who had bent over desks, tracing letters by candlelight. For a child, the book was not a mere object but a sacred artifact. Turning its pages was an act of reverence. Inside, the texts varied. Some were collections of psalms, others simple grammars, others yet compilations of moral tales. These tales often featured saints and martyrs, whose lives served as examples of obedience, humility, and endurance. A child might read, or, more often, hear read aloud, the story of Saint Lawrence roasted on a gridiron, or Saint Agnes preserving her chastity under threat, or Saint Benedict resisting the devil's temptations. These were not told with dramatic flair but with sober repetition, meant to reinforce patterns of behavior. The message was always the same: to be good, to obey, to suffer patiently, and to devote one's life to God. Memorization still ruled every corner of education. The human mind was treated as a container to be filled, not a field to be cultivated with questions and ideas. To know something was to remember it exactly, word for word. A child who could not repeat a psalm or recite a grammar rule was considered ignorant, no matter how well they understood its meaning. To us, this may seem limiting, but within the medieval mindset, accuracy of memory was itself a moral act. Forgetfulness was a weakness not only of the mind but of the soul. At the same time, education was increasingly shaped by expectations of the future. For some boys, further study meant entry into the church. Literacy could open the door to clerical positions, copyists, scribes, minor officials, or even priests. For others, especially sons of merchants, reading and writing meant the ability to keep accounts, draft contracts, and conduct business in a growing world of trade. A child's lessons were therefore never abstract. They were bound tightly to what their adult life might demand. For girls, the path was more uneven. Noble daughters might continue their education in convents, where they learned not only Latin prayers but also music, embroidery, and sometimes even medicine. Convents preserved an unusual space for female literacy, though it was almost always tied to religious devotion. For peasant girls, formal schooling usually ended very early, replaced by domestic training at home. And yet, even here, the echoes of the classroom lingered. A girl who had once traced letters on wax might still remember fragments of psalms long into adulthood, reciting them while spinning wool or tending children. We must also not overlook the apprenticeship model of education, which ran parallel to the classroom. A boy who left school at 10 or 12 might enter a workshop, learning a trade by copying the motions of an older craftsman just as he once copied letters from a teacher. The wax tablet was replaced by wood, leather, or iron. Instead of reciting psalms, the boy repeated gestures, hammer strokes, or weaving patterns. The principle was the same: repetition, obedience, memory. In this way, the broader culture of medieval education extended beyond words into every form of learning. The classroom itself, however, remained the crucible where early minds were shaped. Picture once more that cramped, smoky room. The teacher sits at the front, perhaps with a birch rod resting across his knees. Children chant in unison, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of a psalm. The scratching of styluses on wax accompanies the drone of recitation. The air is heavy, and the light dim. For hours, this continues, broken only by the occasional correction, the swish of the rod, or the shuffle of tired feet. To modern eyes, it might seem joyless. But for many medieval children, there was quiet satisfaction in routine. Each day's small victories, the successful recall of a line, the neat carving of a letter, brought pride, even if mixed with fear of failure. In a world where life was hard and uncertain, the discipline of school provided structure. It was predictable in a way that the outside world, marked by famine, plague, or war, could never be. By the end of their schooling, what had these children truly learned? Most would not become scholars or theologians. They would not write original works or question the foundations of their world. Instead, they carried with them fragments, prayers, psalms, alphabets, the ability to read a few lines of Latin. For many, that was enough. To read even haltingly was rare in a largely oral society. The child who could follow the words of a prayer book held a special place in their community. And yet, for all its limitations, medieval education planted seeds that would, over centuries, grow into broader literacy and eventually new ways of thinking. The habits of memory, the copying of texts, the reverence for books, all of these laid groundwork for the cultural shifts that came later, from the universities of the 12th century to the explosion of learning in the Renaissance. The wax tablets and psalters of little children, boring as they may seem, were the first steps in a chain of history that transformed Europe. There is something humbling in that thought. The clumsy scratches on wax, the rote chants of psalms, the stiff posture enforced by stern teachers, all of these were not wasted effort, even if the children themselves sometimes resented it. They were part of a slow, cumulative process by which knowledge was preserved, handed down, and eventually expanded. Without those first dull lessons, there would have been no scholars, no clerks, no scribes to copy and transmit the wisdom of the past. So we return to our question, what did it truly feel like to be that child, bent over a wax tablet, repeating words you did not fully understand? Was it an experience of frustration, of pride, of boredom, or of devotion? Perhaps all at once. Education is never only about content, it is about the shaping of memory, character, and habit. In the medieval classroom, those forces were strong, binding each child not only to their own future but to the vast continuity of tradition. And when the child grew older, leaving behind the wax tablets and psalters, what lingered? Maybe only a handful of Latin phrases, a few prayers muttered in times of fear, or the faint memory of tracing letters on wax until the hand ached. But even that was something. It was a connection to a world larger than themselves, a step into a culture that valued memory and order above all. Education, in the end, was not about opening the door to possibility, it was about reinforcing the walls of tradition. Yet, within those walls, seeds of curiosity still sprouted. The question remains, in a system built so heavily on obedience and memory, how many children secretly dreamed of something more? In the quiet folds of the medieval countryside, learning often began not in great stone cloisters or bustling cathedral schools but in humbler spaces, the village schoolhouse. These were not imposing buildings but modest rooms, sometimes an annex of the parish church, sometimes the corner of a villager's home, and sometimes no more than a bench under a thatched roof. Yet within these plain settings, children first encountered the letters and numbers that shaped their world. The atmosphere was vastly different from the cloister. Instead of monks in their habits, one might find a single parish priest, a clerk, or a literate villager serving as the master. Instead of solemn chants echoing through vaulted stone halls, the hum of reciting voices mingled with the everyday sounds of rural life, the crowing of roosters, the clatter of carts, and the chatter of neighbors passing by. The pupils were children of peasants and tradesfolk, sent when their families could spare them from chores in the fields or workshops. Attendance was irregular, shaped by the rhythms of planting and harvest. In spring and autumn, many children were absent, their hands needed for sowing or reaping. Only in the quieter seasons did more pupils appear at the schoolhouse, a rhythm that meant learning advanced slowly and unevenly. Instruction began, as in other schools, with the alphabet. A wax tablet or a scrap of parchment served as the writing surface, while a stylus or a dull quill marked the letters. The children copied the shapes clumsily, often smearing or scratching too hard. Masters drilled them in repetition. A, B, C, the sound of letters spoken aloud filled the room. Reading was not a silent act but a vocal one, and pupils learned by hearing and repeating together. Yet the village schoolhouse had a distinct flavor. Here, literacy was not only about Latin but also about practical survival. Children memorized prayers, yes, but they also learned simple calculations that could be applied to market days. A farmer's child might need to count sacks of grain, measure bushels, or reckon payment in coin. Thus, alongside the Psalms, pupils practiced addition and subtraction using pebbles or beans on a table. The school day was short and plain. Lessons often took place in the morning before children were sent to fetch water, gather wood, or help with livestock. Meals were simple, bread and ale, sometimes a bit of cheese or broth. The children sat on rough benches or even on the floor, their slates balanced on their knees. Ink and parchment were expensive, so most early lessons left no trace in written form. Discipline, however, was very real. Masters enforced attention with switches or rods, scolding those who whispered or drifted into daydreams. For restless children, the punishment was swift, the memory of it kept order. Yet despite this sternness, there was also a sense of community. The children knew one another, their families worked side by side in the fields, and the schoolhouse was simply another thread in the fabric of village life. As weeks passed, the pupils advanced from letters to syllables, from syllables to short prayers and passages of scripture. They learned the Pater Noster, Our Father, the Ave Maria, and the Credo, Creed, reciting them over and over until they were embedded in memory. These prayers served both as exercises in reading and as tools of devotion, blurring the line between literacy and piety. At times, a master might allow a glimpse of something more. A psalm might be explained, or a line from a sermon elaborated. These moments gave children not only words but meaning, a connection between the sounds they struggled to form and the faith that structured their lives. Still, progress was slow. Some children never advanced beyond the simplest prayers, their time in school cut short by family needs. Others lingered longer, becoming useful clerks or assistants in the parish. A very few, recognized for their aptitude, were sent onward to cathedral schools, where their learning could grow deeper. For most, however, the village schoolhouse was the beginning and the end of formal education. The rhythm of this humble learning shaped medieval childhood in ways both ordinary and profound. To learn even a handful of letters was to step slightly apart from the mass of illiteracy that defined much of rural life. To reckon numbers with beans or pebbles was to hold a small key to market trade and family survival. These skills, modest though they seem, carried weight in a world where most could not read a word. And yet, one wonders what the children themselves thought. Did they dream of mastering Latin like the priests? Did they resent the time spent indoors when the fields beckoned with sun and air? Did they carry pride in copying their first letters, or did they forget the lessons as soon as the harvest called them back to the land? The sources do not say, but the imagination lingers on the small schoolhouse, its rough benches, its murmuring voices, and the mix of boredom and wonder that filled it. Here, in these village corners, literacy and number first touched the lives of ordinary medieval children. And the story of their schooling is not yet complete. For beyond the basics of letters and prayers lay deeper lessons, grammar, reckoning, and the first steps toward the wider world of learning. The village schoolhouse was not designed to create scholars of renown. Its task was far humbler, to give ordinary children the tools to survive in a world that was largely illiterate, deeply religious, and always teetering on the edge of subsistence. By the time pupils had mastered their first prayers and letters, the lessons turned to grammar, reckoning, and the practical uses of literacy. This was where the schoolhouse became not only a place of learning but also a link between faith, work, and community. Grammar, in medieval education, meant more than memorizing rules. It was the foundation of Latin, the language of the church, the law, and much of written culture. In the village, teaching grammar was often simplified. Children did not dive into complex texts immediately. Instead, they were introduced to simple Latin phrases that structured prayer, the Mass, and everyday clerical life. The goal was not fluency but familiarity, enough knowledge to recite, to follow, and perhaps to copy. Teachers leaned heavily on repetition. Pupils recited conjugations aloud, their voices blending into a rhythmic chant, amo, amas, amat. The sounds were strange at first, rolling awkwardly off the tongues of children who spoke only their local dialects at home. But through constant drilling, the forms became second nature. The chant of conjugations became as familiar as the chant of psalms. At the same time, writing practice deepened. Once the alphabet was secure, pupils moved on to simple sentences, copying lines from psalms or prayers. The wax tablet was still the main tool, but older pupils sometimes gained access to scraps of parchment. Mistakes were frequent, and corrections harsh. A crooked letter or a missed syllable might earn a rap on the knuckles. The discipline was strict, but the expectation was clear. Writing was not casual, but sacred. To mishandle a word was to mishandle the vessel of meaning itself. Numbers, too, became a larger part of the curriculum. The counting of beans or pebbles advanced to learning Roman numerals. Children memorized the symbols, I, V, X, L, C, D, M, and practiced adding and subtracting them. This was no simple task, the system lacked the clarity of later Arabic numerals. But for the medieval child, mastering Roman numerals was essential. They appeared on church documents, charters, and even sundials. To read them was to enter into the rhythms of both religion and governance. Reckoning with numbers extended into daily life. Pupils might be asked to calculate the cost of a loaf of bread, the measure of a bushel of grain, or the tally of sheep in a small flock. In this way, the schoolhouse was not entirely removed from the fields and markets. Arithmetic, though clothed in Latin symbols, touched the very soil of the village. By now, the children also began to experience the moral dimension of education. Lessons were not only about skill but about shaping character. Masters repeated proverbs and sayings, drawn from both scripture and local tradition, as part of the curriculum. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, they warned, or a lie stains the tongue. Such maxims were drilled into pupils alongside conjugations and sums, weaving morality into the fabric of learning. The rhythm of the school day mirrored the rhythm of the village. Lessons paused for feast days, for church festivals, and for the pressing needs of harvest. At times, the master himself might be absent, called away to assist with parish duties or community events. In such cases, the children waited or were dismissed, returning to their chores at home. Education was never detached from the needs of the land, it bent and swayed with the cycles of labor. Still, for many children, the schoolhouse opened a doorway. To be able to read even a little meant access to texts beyond oral tradition. To be able to reckon meant freedom from reliance on another's tally. These skills carried weight, and in some cases, they altered a child's future. A boy who showed aptitude might become a parish clerk, assisting with records and accounts. A girl who demonstrated skill might serve in a convent, where her literacy would find daily use in prayer and copying. Yet, the limitations remained. Books were scarce, and paper rare. Most pupils never held more than a handful of texts in their lifetimes. Learning was slow, uneven, and often interrupted. Many left school after only a season or two, their education forever unfinished. But even this fragment of knowledge lingered, surfacing in moments of trade, devotion, or conversation. A child who could recite the credo or write his name carried a distinction in the village, however small. The discipline of the schoolhouse also shaped behavior. The switch or rod left its mark not only on the body but on the memory. Pupils learned that learning required patience, submission, and endurance. These values were as much a part of education as letters or numbers. In the eyes of their teachers, a child's soul was shaped as much by obedience as by knowledge. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss these lessons as dull or meager. But within their narrow confines, the seeds of broader culture were planted. The repetition of Latin prayers tied children into a universal rhythm of faith. The copying of words connected them to traditions stretching back centuries. The counting of pebbles, crude as it seems, foreshadowed the arithmetic that would one day underpin trade and science. As the children grew, their time in the schoolhouse often came to an end. Some returned fully to farm work, their learning left as a half-remembered skill. Others carried their letters and numbers into adulthood, becoming slightly more literate, slightly more empowered, than their neighbors. A rare few continued on to higher schools, their origins in the village classroom fading into memory. But whether brief or extended, the experience of the schoolhouse left its mark. The benches, the wax tablets, the chants of conjugations and prayers, these became part of childhood memory, etched as firmly as the tasks of planting or harvesting. And so the question lingers, what did it mean, in a world where most lived and died without reading a single word, for a child to hold even a fragment of literacy? Was it empowerment, or was it a burden? Did it lift them above their peers, or isolate them? Did they sense the larger world of learning, or did they simply see school as another duty, another discipline to be endured? The answer is uncertain. But what is certain is that the village schoolhouse, plain and modest, was a small engine of continuity. It preserved prayers, kept accounts, and passed down the fragments of learning that allowed communities to endure. And in its quiet way, it prepared children not only for survival but for participation in the rhythms of faith and society. By the later stages of their schooling, medieval village children had already crossed the threshold from raw beginners to semi-literate members of their community. They could recognize letters, copy short texts, recite prayers, and reckon with simple sums. But what truly mattered now was how these skills connected to the larger fabric of daily life. The curriculum of the schoolhouse did not stretch endlessly upward. There was no ladder leading from simple grammar into higher philosophy for most pupils. Instead, the final lessons reinforced the practical and moral foundations that children would carry into adulthood. These last stages of learning, though modest, were designed to prepare them for the lives they were destined to live. One of the most significant lessons was the practice of catechism, a structured teaching of Christian doctrine through question and answer. The children were drilled in the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed, along with explanations of their meaning. Masters often used call and response, asking, "Who made you?" and waiting for the child to reply, "God made me." Such lessons tied literacy directly to salvation. To forget one's catechism was not only an educational failing but a spiritual danger. The church calendar also guided the rhythm of school. Children learned the names of feast days, saints' days, and fasts. They memorized the order of holy seasons, Advent, Lent, Easter, and their associated rituals. This was knowledge every villager relied on, but school children carried it in a more formal way, as part of their training. To understand the calendar was to understand the flow of both worship and labor, since the two were intertwined at the same time. The children were given deeper practice in writing. Copying became more precise. Older pupils were asked to copy whole passages, sometimes under the eye of a master who corrected each crooked letter. A child who showed steadiness of hand might even be asked to assist in copying parish records or drafting simple documents. In this way, literacy fed directly into the machinery of local administration. Arithmetic advanced as well. Pupils learned not only Roman numerals but also simple reckonings of weight, measure, and currency. They practiced problems relevant to market life. How many pence make a shilling? How many eggs can be bought for a penny? How to divide grain fairly among neighbors. These exercises were rooted in the village economy, giving children tools that could serve them when they bartered at the market or counted a harvest. Discipline, too, remained a constant thread. By this stage, children understood the expectations. They knew that inattention would earn punishment, that obedience was part of learning. Yet, the severity sometimes softened as pupils grew older. The master might show more patience with those nearing the end of their schooling, recognizing that they were soon to leave the benches for adult responsibilities. There was a sense of transition, from child to worker, from pupil to participant in the life of the village. One cannot overlook the social role of the schoolhouse. It was not simply about knowledge but about belonging. Children who had sat together on the rough benches formed bonds that extended into adulthood. They shared the memory of reciting prayers, of scratching letters into wax, of being corrected by the master's rod. These shared experiences helped knit the community together. Even those who learned little academically carried the sense of having passed through a stage of life alongside their peers. What happened after children left the schoolhouse varied. Most returned to their families' work in the fields, using their skills occasionally, counting sheep, recognizing a name on a charter, reciting a prayer at church. A smaller number took on roles as clerks, scribes, or assistants to the parish priest, where literacy became a daily tool. For girls, the future depended heavily on family decisions. Some entered convents, where their training in prayer and letters continued, others applied their limited schooling only within the household. The end of schooling often came abruptly. There was no graduation, no ceremony. A family might simply decide that their child was needed more at home than at the bench. The master might dismiss a pupil whose progress had stalled. Or, in some cases, a child might quietly stop attending, never to return. The transition from learning to working was fluid, shaped by necessity more than design. And yet, the legacy of the schoolhouse lingered. A man who could write his name, however clumsily, carried an identity distinct from one who marked only with a cross. A woman who remembered the Psalms from childhood schooling could recite them in times of hardship, giving voice to prayers that others only heard in church. Even half-formed skills had meaning, shaping the way individuals moved through their world. Looking at these children from the distance of centuries, it is tempting to measure their education by modern standards and find it lacking. They did not read widely, did not analyze texts, did not debate philosophy. But such judgments missed the point. For the medieval village, the schoolhouse was not about unlocking potential but about preserving continuity. It ensured that the prayers, numbers, and traditions of the community were passed on. It prepared children not for a life of discovery but for a life of belonging. And yet, one must ask, in the quiet minds of those children, did sparks of curiosity ever flicker? Did one boy wonder what lay beyond the Latin phrases he recited? Did one girl, tracing letters with care, imagine a life of learning beyond the convent or the home? The records are silent, but the possibility remains. Even in the most structured and narrow systems, curiosity has a way of stirring. So the story of the village schoolhouse closes with a paradox. On the surface, it was simple, repetitive, even dull: bread and ale at the midday break, wax tablets scratched by tired hands, the same prayers repeated endlessly. And yet, within its monotony lay the seeds of literacy, morality, and community. These humble lessons, taught in smoke-darkened rooms, prepared generations to sustain their villages through the long centuries. And in that small act, teaching a child to read a line, to reckon a sum, to recite a creed, the village schoolhouse played its quiet part in the vast sweep of history. To imagine the world of a medieval classroom, you must first leave behind the picture of desks neatly lined, of chalk on a blackboard, or even the hum of a modern schoolyard. The medieval classroom was smaller, darker, and far more austere. It was, at its core, a place where children were brought not to be entertained, but to be shaped, sometimes harshly, into obedient Christians and useful members of their community. The classroom was often nothing more than a simple room adjoining the parish church or the priest's dwelling. In towns, it might be set aside within a guild hall or a rented chamber, but in villages the school was wherever the master could gather his pupils. The walls were usually bare stone or timber, sometimes damp, sometimes smoke-stained. Sunlight filtered in through narrow slits of windows, casting uneven beams across rough wooden benches. In winter, the air was cold enough that children huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the air as they recited their lessons. In summer, the room smelled of sweat, wax, and ink. Children arrived carrying little with them. Some clutched a wax tablet and stylus, their most basic tools of writing; others had scraps of parchment, sometimes reused from older documents where the ink had been scraped away. The wealthier pupils carried quills and small ink pots, though even these were treasured possessions, carefully guarded. Most wore simple woolen tunics, patched and resewn many times. Footwear was not guaranteed; in poorer villages, children might arrive barefoot, dust clinging to their legs. The school day began with prayer. Pupils stood, crossed themselves, and repeated the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, in Latin. The words were chanted, sometimes clearly, sometimes stumbled through by younger mouths not yet used to the cadence. Prayer set the tone; it reminded the pupils, and their master, that learning was not a worldly pursuit but a spiritual duty. To learn Latin was not only to become literate. It was to enter the language of Scripture and salvation. After prayer, the lessons began. The master, often a parish priest or a clerk, stood at the front with a worn book in his hands. Books were rare and precious, often chained to the desk, for their value was immense. Many children would never touch the book itself, but they would hear its contents recited, line by line. The first and most essential lesson was Latin grammar. The pupils repeated after the master, amo, amas, amat. The rhythm was drilled endlessly, voices rising and falling together, a chorus of repetition. The point was not comprehension at first, it was memorization. Only through memorization could comprehension come later. The younger children scratched their letters into wax tablets, their hands clumsy and slow. Mistakes could be smoothed over with the flat end of the stylus, but the habit of discipline remained. Every letter had to be neat, every line straight. Older pupils copied whole sentences onto parchment scraps, dipping their quills into ink, carefully avoiding blotches. To spoil parchment was to waste something costly, and the master was quick to notice. Writing was more than skill, it was a form of moral training, a test of patience and care. The classroom was never entirely silent. At times it rang with the chanting of conjugations, at others, it hummed with the scratching of styluses. Children whispered when they thought the master's back was turned. A bored boy might doodle crude figures into his wax, quickly smoothing them over if caught. A girl, tired of reciting, might rest her chin in her palm, only to be startled awake by the master's sharp word. Discipline hung heavy in the room, a constant reminder that idleness was not to be tolerated. Midday brought a short break. Children ate the food they had brought from home, crusts of coarse bread, small pieces of cheese, dried fish, or onions. The better-off pupils might share meat or fruit, drawing envious glances. For drink, ale was common, since water was often unsafe. The midday meal was short, often eaten outside the classroom walls if weather allowed. Children laughed and jostled one another, a brief release from the stiffness of the benches. But the reprieve did not last long. The master called them back, and once again the monotony of lessons resumed. The afternoon was often devoted to reckoning, the teaching of arithmetic. Children counted with pebbles, beans, or lines scratched onto tablets. Roman numerals were introduced, I, V, X, L, C, D, M. The system was difficult and unwieldy, but it was necessary for record-keeping, for taxes, for church accounts. Problems were practical, drawn from daily life: how to divide a bushel of grain, how to reckon the price of eggs, how to calculate a tithe. These lessons tied directly to the rhythms of village and town life. A child who could reckon was not only more useful to his family but less likely to be cheated in the marketplace. As the day wore on, fatigue grew. Children fidgeted on the hard benches, their hands cramped from writing, their voices hoarse from recitation. The master's patience was often thin. A sharp glance, a raised voice, or the ever-present rod reminded the pupils that discipline was part of learning. Punishment was swift, a smack across the knuckles with a ruler, a rap on the head, or time spent kneeling on cold stone. Such methods were accepted, even expected. Parents rarely objected, believing that strictness was necessary to build both knowledge and character. The school day ended much as it began, with prayer. Children recited once more, thanking God for the lessons and asking for the strength to remember them. Their voices, tired and uneven, echoed in the dim room. The master closed his book, dismissed the pupils, and the children spilled out into the fading light. Some ran, eager to return to chores or games, others trudged slowly, weighed down by fatigue. But each carried with them the imprint of the days. Discipline, the echo of prayers, the feel of the stylus in hand, the sore wrist from writing, or the sting of punishment. This was the rhythm of the medieval classroom, repetitive, rigid, yet quietly transformative. Children learned not only their letters and numbers but the habits of obedience, endurance, and faith. For some, these lessons would open doors, to clerical work, to positions in guilds, or to service in noble households. For others, the learning would fade into memory, recalled only when a prayer was spoken or a number counted at market. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, how did the children themselves perceive these classrooms? Did they sit on the benches with a sense of burden, dreaming of fields and freedom? Or did some sense, however dim, that the scratch of stylus and the chant of Latin might carry them into a world larger than their village? The answer remains hidden, locked away in voices that history never recorded. That if the medieval classroom was a place of learning, it was equally a place of discipline. To be a pupil was not only to memorize Latin conjugations or to learn the art of writing, it was to be shaped by rules that governed both mind and body. For the medieval master, instruction and correction were inseparable. To correct mistakes in grammar or handwriting was to correct faults of character, to punish idleness was to punish sin itself. In the eyes of teacher and parent alike, discipline was not cruelty, but a necessary medicine for young souls. The rod, therefore, was as familiar a tool in the classroom as the book or the wax tablet. It was often a slender stick or switch, kept within easy reach of the master's desk. Its very presence was a silent warning. Children learned quickly that a wandering gaze, a whispered word, or a half-finished exercise could invite its sting. A rap across the knuckles, a stroke on the back, or a sharp smack on the legs left no doubt about the seriousness of study. Modern ears might recoil at such treatment, but for medieval families, the rod was a sign of care. To spare discipline was, they believed, to spoil the child, and in an age when survival depended on obedience and hard work, indulgence was a luxury few could afford. Yet punishment went beyond the rod. Some children were made to kneel on cold stone floors for long periods, hands raised above their heads until their arms trembled with fatigue. Others were ordered to stand in the corner, visible to all, as a lesson in shame. Public correction was part of the system. The fault of one child became the warning for others. Tears and flushed faces were common sights, yet such displays were not met with sympathy. To the master, they were signs that the lesson, both academic and moral, was being absorbed. The strictness of discipline was matched by the strictness of the curriculum itself. Pupils spent hours memorizing rules of Latin grammar, reciting them aloud until the sounds blurred into monotony. A missed word could mean repeating the entire exercise, and mistakes in writing had to be laboriously corrected. Sloppy letters were scraped from parchment or smoothed away from wax, but the shame of the error lingered. The master's scolding voice cut through the murmurs, demanding precision, demanding attention. Every crooked line was not only an error of the hand but a mark of laziness in the soul. For children, the burden was heavy. Many arrived at school already weary from morning chores. A boy might have helped drive cattle to pasture before dawn, or a girl might have spent hours fetching water or tending to younger siblings. By the time they reached their benches, their hands were already rough with work, their backs tired. Yet the expectation was the same, to sit upright, to recite clearly, to keep the stylus steady. Fatigue was no excuse. The master's task was not to make allowances but to forge endurance. Hunger too was a constant companion. Families often sent children with little more than bread and perhaps a wedge of cheese for the midday meal. The classroom could be a place of growling stomachs, of distracted eyes following the crumbs of wealthier pupils. Hunger slowed the tongue in recitation and dulled the hand in writing. But hunger was also part of discipline. It reminded children that life was not about comfort. To endure hunger, to keep learning despite it, was seen as a mark of strength. And then there was the struggle with Latin itself. For most children, it was a foreign tongue. Their everyday speech was English, French, or a local dialect of German or Italian, depending on the region. To learn Latin was to step into a language of priests and scholars, one that felt distant and abstract. Words had to be memorized without context, grammar drilled long before meaning became clear. It was a task that often frustrated pupils, leaving them muttering sounds that felt strange on their lips. Yet perseverance was demanded, for Latin was the gateway to the scriptures, to the liturgy, to the higher paths of learning. To falter in Latin was to falter in the very foundation of education. The emotional weight of such schooling was heavy. Some children shrank under the master's stern gaze, their confidence eroded by constant correction. Others grew defiant, enduring punishment with clenched jaws and silent resentment. Still others took pride in small victories, a correctly written line, a passage recited without error. Praise was rare, but when it came, it glowed in the memory. A nod of approval, a word of encouragement, could mean more than hours of chastisement. Discipline differed by gender as well. In mixed schools, boys bore the brunt of corporal punishment, while girls were often disciplined with scolding, shaming, or extra tasks. In convent schools, where girls were taught by nuns, discipline was just as strict but more moral in tone. Girls might be punished for vanity, for whispering, or for lack of modesty. Their education, though still grounded in Latin and Scripture, emphasized obedience, humility, and preparation for roles as wives, mothers, or nuns. But whether boy or girl, noble-born or peasant's child, the expectation was the same: to learn under discipline, to bend the will to the order of the classroom. What strikes us today as harsh was, in the medieval mind, simply necessary. The world itself was unforgiving. Crops failed, winters were long, sickness was sudden. Survival demanded toughness, obedience, and faith. The classroom, in its severity, mirrored the larger society. Just as peasants endured labor, just as soldiers endured drill, so children endured correction. To be softened by ease was to risk ruin. The master's rod was not an exception to life's hardships but an introduction to them. Yet even in such a system, there were moments of kindness. A master might offer a smile at a well-done exercise, or quietly excuse a child who had tried but failed. Some teachers were remembered in later writings not for their cruelty but for their fairness, their patient repetition, their steady guidance. Students who went on to become priests or clerks sometimes spoke of their masters with respect, recalling not only the pain of correction but the gift of learning that discipline had secured. The memory of strictness could soften with time, leaving gratitude in its place. Still, one cannot overlook the darker side. Some masters were known for excessive severity, their tempers quick, their punishments harsher than custom demanded. Such men were feared more than respected, their classrooms places of dread rather than learning. Yet few parents objected. The belief ran deep that suffering built strength, and so long as the children emerged literate and obedient, the means were tolerated. The medieval classroom was thus a crucible. Within its walls, children were tested not only in mind but in spirit and body. They learned to read and write, yes, but they also learned to endure hunger, to withstand fatigue, to accept correction. The classroom was not a place of comfort but of shaping, where the raw material of childhood was pressed into the form of disciplined adulthood. And yet, we are left with a question that cannot be answered easily: was this discipline truly a form of care, as the masters and parents believed, or was it cruelty masked as education? Did the rod and the scolding voice forge better adults, or did they crush the joy of learning before it could bloom? The medieval child, silent in the records, cannot tell us. All we can do is trace the outlines of their days, and wonder at the price they paid for knowledge. When the school day ended and the benches fell silent, the medieval child carried more than wax tablets and half-finished exercises back into daily life. The classroom was a place of repetition, correction, and weariness, but its traces lingered in every pupil who passed through it. For the fortunate few, schooling opened real opportunities. The son of a merchant, able to read and keep accounts, could move into clerical or trade positions. The diligent boy who mastered his Latin recitations might advance to cathedral schools, perhaps even to the universities. For him, the stern gaze of the schoolmaster and the sting of correction were the first steps on a road that led far beyond his village. But most children did not climb so high. Many attended only long enough to learn their prayers, a little reading, or basic reckoning. After a few years, they returned to work in fields, workshops, or households. The lessons they took back were modest: how to read a psalter, how to add sums in a market stall, how to copy a name. Yet even this modest schooling left a mark. A girl able to read aloud a devotional text, a boy who could tally harvest shares, both carried skills rare in their communities. The memory of discipline was perhaps the most lasting of all. Children remembered the rod as much as the recitations, the scolding voice as much as the Latin chants. Some recalled their masters as fair, others as harsh, but almost all accepted discipline as part of education. In a society where survival demanded obedience and endurance, the schoolroom prepared children not only for knowledge but for the rigors of adult life. Still, when we look back, questions linger. Did discipline crush joy, or did it build resilience? Did it silence curiosity, or did it kindle a spark that carried some forward into the world of books and ideas? The records do not answer. We are left with fragments, scratched letters, worn benches, memories written centuries later, that hint at both hardship and growth. The medieval classroom, in the end, was a reflection of its world, unequal, demanding, but purposeful. It gave some the tools to rise, it offered others only discipline to endure, but it shaped them all according to the values of the age: faith, order, and obedience. And so we are left with a quiet thought: if you had been one of those children, bent over a wax tablet in the dim light of a medieval schoolroom, would you have endured with patience, resisted in silence, or found a way to thrive?